we don't often think too critically about how we came to belong in the Christian church. The absence of this question is not just true for us in here, it's often true in our society at large. How did we come to belong to the people of God is often a question just as simple, just as elementary as, how did I come to be an American? How did I come to be an Episcopalian? Or how did I come to be a Texan? But these things are a part of us, or we are a part of them, at such a basic level that we don't often think too deeply about what it means to be a part of them. Of course, you've heard it said that fish don't know they swim, birds don't know they fly, right? It can be difficult to examine how you got to be where you are. As any business person knows, sometimes defining a mission statement, defining who you are or what you're about, can be half the battle. It takes some effort. It takes us thinking deeply about where we came from and who we wish to be. Let me take that from the abstract to an everyday life example, perhaps. Let's say we were to head over to White Rock Lake and interrupt a random jogger passing by. Now, if they weren't too angry at us for ruining their exercise, maybe we could give them a quick opinion poll. We could ask them something like, who are the Episcopalians? Or how does one become an Episcopalian? Now, provided this person didn't wrinkle their nose and say, a what? A what now? We might get an answer. We might get an answer something like that Robin Williams listicle that went around 20 years or so ago. Do you remember this one? The top 10 reasons for being an Episcopalian. I worry some of us didn't realize that Robin was joking there, but that's a sermon for another time. Maybe the jogger gives a better, more well-informed answer. Something like, well, I've heard Episcopalians are members of the worldwide Anglican Communion, Christians who, despite the turmoil of the Reformation, managed to hang on to the offices of bishop, priest, and deacon. Their prayer book is organized according to the Book of Common Prayer, something like that. It's a lot to expect of the jogger at the lake. But in that instance, we're getting a handful of true answers about what it means to belong to this thing right here. But I'm going to try to explain to you today that these identity markers, however true they might be, are not primary, are not foundational. That is, at the end of the day, they are not the main reason why any of us really gather right here, right now. And Abraham's starring role in today's liturgy can prove it. When we consider Abraham, we're going to discover that the question, how did we come to belong to the church, has an even more basic, more elementary answer. You can take out your bulletin as we go through the reading from Genesis. The mission that God sends Abraham on is probably familiar to many or most of us. The reading from Genesis tells it like so. The Lord said to Abram, you see, this was before his name was changed to Abraham, which means the father of a multitude. Abram, leave your country, your family, and your father's house, and travel to the land that I will show you. I'll bless you with a great name, I'll make you a great nation, and you will be a blessing to others. Now, Abram, we should assume, was perfectly fine staying where he was. He was not looking to leave his homeland. His homeland was perhaps just all right with him. Why bother listening to this strange, demanding God who appears suddenly from nowhere? Well, it's because it's actually a pretty good deal, if you think about it. If he obeys God and leaves his homeland to move to a new promised land, he'll be the father of a multitude, a brand new nation. And this promise about God's blessing comes to him on his 75th birthday. Not the ideal time to start a family, but better late than never to start believing the Lord's promises, to receive a blessing. Note here that a blessing is a sign of something which shows God's favor. To be blessed in this context is to receive a good gift from the Lord. It's not like God's telling Abraham, oh, bless your heart, you poor old buffoon, which is sort of the way that Texans use the phrase. So Honest Abe, as his friends call him, at 75 years old, didn't move to Tallahassee to retire, but left all he had behind him and followed the Lord out into the bright unknown. skip over in the bulletin to the book of Romans, the letter to the Romans. I think it might be on the same page. Our scripture readings then leave Genesis behind and jump ahead to a complicated sounding section of the letter from St. Paul to the Romans. But it really just sounds complex. Once we untangle a few knots, I'm confident we'll be able to understand the message almost intuitively. Abraham is again a main character, and St. Paul begins with a rhetorical question. Is Abraham our father according to the flesh? It's another way of saying, is Abraham one of our founding fathers in the faith by blood? Is he our father in the faith because we are genetically linked to him? He'll return to that point in a minute, but first he takes us down a different path. He's going to talk about these identity markers, the things we think join us to a group. If Abraham was justified by his work, that is, the identity markers of Judaism, like circumcision, like the keeping of the law, then he has something to boast about before God. If, like Robin Williams' joke ironically shows, we think that what unites us here is our good taste, or any other created thing, then we might have something to brag about before the Lord. God, I belong to your family because I have accomplished X, Y, or Z. Paul doesn't see Abraham that way. Instead, he tells it differently. Abraham believed God, and this belief was credited to him as righteousness. The mission God sends Abraham on, and the promise that he and his wife Sarah would be the parents of a huge family starting after age 75 is, of course, outlandish. But it's a promise Abraham believes. You know, Abraham could have argued with God here. What do you mean I have to believe things, Lord? Don't you know it's what I do that defines me? Don't you know that in religion, deeds are so much more important than creeds? Paul's point is that Abraham did not earn or win his righteous status before God by leaning on these religious identity markers. God said he was righteous before even his circumcision, before he offers up his son, even before he steps over the threshold of his front door. Why? On the basis of faith. On the basis of Abram's willingness to believe in God's outlandishness. The letter goes on to say that God viewed Abraham as righteous even before the circumcision, that incredibly important, critical Jewish mark of being and belonging. Before Abram even bore in his body the sign of the covenant. Before Abraham even accomplished that most basic identity marker, in the courtroom of heaven, our courteous Lord called him righteous, not guilty, acquitted, on the right track. Not because God found his accomplishments particularly impressive. If that were true, Abraham would have something to brag about. If that were true, God would have owed Abraham his righteous status like an employee on payday. But there aren't bragging rights in God's kingdom. The promise that Abraham would inherit the world did not come after his joining this or that humanitarian cause, or even after enacting religious ritual. Abraham was called righteous before any of this happens. Why? Because of his belief, because of his faith in the outlandishness of God. St. Paul goes on to answer then what he asked at the beginning of the reading. Because God did this for Abraham, this is why Gentiles, that is, folks like you and me, or people who didn't grow up ethnically Jewish, who didn't originally belong to Abraham's family, are able to get in on the promises. Like a laborer who shows up to work at the day's final hour and gets paid just as much as the 9-to-5 crew. Jesus had a bit of a story about that, didn't he? It's good news for you and for me because we share this belief of Abraham's. That's the point. People like us share the faith of Abraham, illumined now as it is by the revelation of God in Jesus. Jesus, who in today's gospel reading showed Nicodemus the outlandishness of God in asking him to be born a second time by water and the Spirit. This is why the children's song, Father Abraham, which you should be grateful I won't sing for you right now, really does point us in the right direction. Friends, The Episcopal Church is perhaps notorious for being the faith of converts. So many of us are so happy that we escaped the dead, rigid, moral legalism of the Catholics or the vapid, happy-clappy emotionalism of the evangelicals in order to arrive at a place like this one where, as Robin Williams jokes, whatever you believe, there's bound to be someone that agrees with you here. But friends, our faith and the content of our belief matters immensely. What bloody difference does it make if you and one other person can go down the pan-religious buffet and borrow something from Buddhism and Stoicism and something vaguely reminiscent of Jesus? Whatever you believe, there's bound to be one other person that agrees with you. Joke's on us if we don't get that's a joke. The content of our faith matters immensely because on the basis of Abraham's faith, he was counted righteous. Neither he nor you nor I are here because we're especially clever at picking things off the pan-religious buffet that we like. Ooh, Old Testament, I'm not sure. No, I don't know about that. Okay, New Testament. Okay, so like Richard Rohr, yeah. Nadia Bolz-Weber, yeah. Let's see, who else? Jesus, okay, Jesus. Into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. Ooh, I don't like that one. Oh, judge not. Yes. I like that one. As the scriptures show us time and time again, faith is ultimately a gift God gives to us anyway. We have nothing to boast about. Isn't that what we say every time in the Eucharist? By him and with him and in him be all glory and honor. The whole of the material for worship and life itself described in the language of gift. The lesson St. Paul's audience has to learn about Abraham is that those things they thought were integral to their identity, those things which they thought made them what they were, even the good and holy ones, were not primary. They weren't the main thing. God as divine judge makes Abraham righteous. God as divine judge rules in Abraham's favor to declare him justified in the clear. It's why the Jews eventually end up circumcising their infant boys and why we baptize our infant children, because God was always reaching out to us before we even knew his name, even before we stepped over the threshold of our own doors. God as judge both declared Abraham just and made him so. And that's the kind of judge we need. Never believe anybody who tells you they don't want to be judged. We desperately want to be judged, but to be judged fairly, righteously, and acquitted. Our courteous Lord is the kind of judge you want. One judge who makes us just and then declares it so on the basis of our faith. Abraham trusts in God's outlandish plan. And on the basis of this, not his resume, not anything else, Abraham was called righteous. And then, setting off from his front door and then his country, Abraham got to know a certain God, a great king above all gods, in whose hands are the corners of the earth, who gives life to the dead and calls into being those things which did not exist. Is that the God you believe in? One who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that were not. One who calls into existence children from a good-as-dead couple like Abraham and Sarah. One who gives life to the dead, especially in the resurrection of his only son. What might that God call into existence here? What might he raise up from the dead amongst us? What could happen when we realize that before God it's not our artistic moorings, nor our reputation, nor our beautiful offerings, not even our cherished commitments to remain welcome and inclusive to all sorts and conditions of men that will justify us in the court of heaven? Can you imagine the absurdity of standing before the blazing terror of our God enthroned in judgment on the last day and holding up anything to justify your presence there? Everything we are, everything we have, God has given us already. What could we possibly boast about? Being and belonging to God's people was God's gift to Abraham and to us. That is more important than any other identity marker that we here could claim. It's more primary for us even than identifying as Episcopalians or as Americans or Texans, if you can believe it. This is more important than whatever you did or didn't do on Super Tuesday. Whatever other lesser identity markers you should choose. You know what keeps Father Rob and I up at night sometimes? We really worry that deep down we think we'll be accepted by God because of someone's ideologically consistent voting record. In this season of Lent, in addition to your fasts and self-denial, spend some time in meditation upon this truth. God, who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? God has given us the gifts beyond measure and beyond what we deserve, and he did it even before we realized it was the case, before we crossed over the threshold, before we knew his name, before we accomplished anything at all. That being the case, which one of us could stand before the King of the universe, our uncompromisingly holy judge who dwells in unapproachable light, and say anything other than thank you?